For several years, gun violence has increased both in Sweden and in the US. Why is gun violence on the rise, and how are we to combat it? I welcome you all to this SNS webinar. My name is Emily Lekebjer, and I am working with the SNS research project Crime and Society that started in January this year. We at SNS are very honored that Professor Philip J. Cook is joining us today to give a presentation on his research on gun violence. We will also be joined by two researchers from Malmö University and the Swedish Police Authority. I will leave the more extensive presentation of our speakers to our excellent moderator, Willy Silberstein. But before I hand over to Willy, I would like to encourage all of you who are attending this webinar to participate in the conversation. It will be possible to ask questions both in writing and verbally, and you can ask a written question by using the Q&A function that you will find in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. During the panel discussions, I will read your questions to our speakers. And please ask your question in English and keep it rather short. You can also ask a question verbally by using the raise hand function, also located in the toolbar. Willy will address you by name if he wishes for you to ask your question out loud. And when you are called on to ask your question, please make sure to unmute your microphone. And once you unmute yourself, you will be able to ask your question or give a short comment. And in order to have an even more interactive conversation here today, we have also opened up the chat function where you can comment on the topics raised today. The other webinar participants will be able to read and react to your comments as well. Once again, a warm welcome. And now I would like to hand over to Willy Silberstein, who is a former journalist at the news desk of Swedish Radio. Willy, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Emily, and welcome all of you who are watching us from screens around the country and maybe also in other countries. This seminar will start with Professor Philip Cook, as you heard, and what I would like to emphasize is that we are very eager to hear questions from you. And remember, you can ask stupid questions and rude questions, and Emily will read them out, and nobody will even know who asked them. So just ask all questions that you have on your mind. Having said that, I give the screen to Professor Philip Cook from Duke University in North Carolina. Philip, the screen is yours, please.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much to NSF for providing me with this opportunity to talk about gun violence and gun violence prevention. I have been doing research in this general area for almost 50 years now, off and on, though I take neither the credit nor the blame to what has happened during that time in terms of the actual level of violence. So I would like to share screens. Okay. And let me just say that I'll talk for about 25 minutes and then look forward to the question and answer. I will mostly be focusing on the situation in the United States, which is appropriate since that's what I know about. And I will leave it to you to bring in questions about how this applies to Sweden or does not apply. Of course, the US is famous or infamous for leading the developed world in gun ownership and in gun violence. But let me talk just very briefly about guns as a ordinary commodity. And in the US, there are about as many guns in private hands as there are people, over 300 million. And so the first thing to be said about them is that they are very popular and very prevalent, and that they provide utility to the owners in terms of recreation and perhaps peace of mind. It should be said, though, that not everybody has a gun. Something like 40% of the households have at least one. And the people that have it tend to have several with an average of 5. It also, beyond having this kind of recreational use, sometimes has a virtuous use, which is defending against criminal attack. And we shouldn't ignore that possibility because it does happen from time to time. But what has brought us together, and of course what motivates the conversation in the United States, is much more about the damage that guns do than economists would call the negative externalities of gun ownership. And indeed, they are widely misused and with deadly effect. So what we see here is the kind of most recent data that are generally available nationwide of 45,000 deaths from suicide and homicide. 20,000 of those were homicides, and these days, almost all the homicides in the US are committed with guns. Knives and other weapons are quite rare. And a little more than half of all of the suicides are committed with guns. These numbers have to be understood, of course, in the context of a country that has a much larger population than Sweden. But the interesting fact for me is that I live in North Carolina, which has the same population as Sweden. And so I compared the number of gun homicides in Sweden and in North Carolina. There were, in 2020, 48 gun homicides in Sweden and 766 in North Carolina. So that gives you an idea of the enormous gap between the two places. Do not follow our lead. Here's another view of what has happened in the US. The top line shows you the homicide rate per 100,000 population. And of course, the most notable thing is that it has declined since 1993, and in fact dropped to half the peak level during the era of crack cocaine. And then it has crept up since about 2014 with an unprecedented jump in 2020, the beginning of the COVID pandemic. The other thing that has happened, the gun homicides are a component of that, and they have followed the same path, of course, but they also have become a larger and larger percentage over time of the total. So that gives you some idea. Currently, the gun homicide rate in many cities has gotten back to the level that they experienced in the early 1990s. All right, so that's by way of introduction to the US. The agenda I have set for myself is to talk about what I see as 3 major topics that help frame the conversation about gun violence prevention. And the first one is understanding the nature of the problem of gun violence and what sort of burden it imposes on the public. The second topic is to talk about the availability of guns and how that influences their misuse. And the third topic is to talk about policing and accountability as kind of an old-fashioned response to gun violence. All right. So part 1, instrumentality and social costs. Let me say that when I started doing research in this area in the 1970s, this was a matter of great debate in the US. It was a question about whether the type of weapon really mattered in assaults and in criminal attacks and in suicides or suicide attempts. And, you know, there was definitely a notion, a myth, that all that mattered really was the intention of the attacker. And so that spawned the famous slogan, the bumper strip, "Guns don't kill people, people kill people," which said, let's focus on the character and the mental health issues and other ways, the motivations of individuals, because if they can't get guns, they'll find another weapon to accomplish the same purpose. Guns are irrelevant. The type of weapon is irrelevant. And this turns out to be dead wrong. The truth is that for a given intention or capability or character of the attacker, the likelihood of death in a criminal attack, it depends on the power of the weapon, not just intent. That's common sense, perhaps now, but it certainly has been a matter of lively debate. It's an area where I've tried to contribute hard evidence on the subject. It's perfectly clear that it matters. We did a study recently in Boston, for example, where we went beyond the question of the choice of weapon as between a gun or a knife and said, well, what about the type of gun? And it turned out that the larger caliber guns were more deadly than the smaller caliber guns in the same circumstances. That if all of the shootings in Boston had been with the smallest caliber, 22 caliber, the homicide rate would have declined by 40%. 40%. So just the type of gun has a big effect on the outcome of gun violence. Beyond that, there are other instrumentality effects. That's the term of art that is used in this area. That guns, of course, provide assailants with the means of killing at a distance, and without much strength or determination. Any 15-year-old can take a gun and kill someone easily. It doesn't require any particular engagement. And as a result of that, they create a greater scope for criminal attack. And in my city of Durham, for example, half the shootings are what are called drive-by shootings, where a bunch of youths will be riding around in a car with guns and shooting out the windows at people they don't like. Certainly the mass shootings in schools and other places are made possible by the availability of military-style weapons and other high-powered weapons that allow the delivery of many bullets in a short period of time. The political violence is all basically with guns in the United States, and the possibility of assassination and other kinds of political violence goes up greatly with guns around. And the fear factor in neighborhoods that have a lot of gun violence is partly just because, of course, bullets can travel a mile or more, and they don't always go anywhere near the intended target. So the possibility of stray bullets is very important. If we tried to measure the burden of gun violence, is something that I think is important. There's two very different approaches. The public health community has tended to focus on the body count, that is the number of actual gunshot victims. If they want to give a monetary value, they multiply the number of gunshot victims by some value of life. And that is, of course, commonplace to say that there are 20,000 homicide deaths, and that with guns, and that is our measure of the social burden. But I think that is misleading in some ways, and certainly far too narrow. The problem with gun violence is not just that people get shot and their lives are shortened, but also that the threat of victimization has an effect on everyone, whether or not they are actual victims. And so that we need to take it into account when we're computing the costs of gun violence, the costs of prevention and of avoidance and of fear and of the traumatization of witnessing gun violence and so forth. So that's a project that I've worked on extensively. And it's useful to think about the analogy to COVID-19, which we are all way too familiar with these days. So one way to measure the burden of COVID is to talk about the number of people who die from it. But of course, the burden of COVID is shared by everyone, whether or not they ever got infected. And we have witnessed in 2020, the economic slowdown, the social isolation, the fear that disrupted everybody's lives across the board. And so if we want to say, what is the social burden of COVID? We would not just say, well, 1 million people in the US died of it. We would say it has profoundly affected our lives and not for the better. And on the flip side, effective prevention then saves lives and improves the quality of life. And that those are, to some extent, separate statements. That on the one hand, of course, it does save lives and disability, but it also improves the quality of life for everyone. For each household, we can talk about the value of personal safety and the safety of others. And then at the neighborhood level, turn to very concrete measures like property values, migration in and out of the neighborhood, the material standard of living, the location of employment, and so forth, all of which is being affected by gun violence. One thing that I did with my co-author Jens Ludwig a little more than 20 years ago is to do what is called the Contingent valuation study, where we simply asked the public using a national survey how much they would pay to reduce gun violence in their community. And from that, we're able to get a very broad measure of the monetary cost or the monetized cost of gun violence. All right, so the conclusions then from this first part is in terms of instrumentality, and the reason why we're here is that gun use and generally the choice of weapons intensifies violence and it increases its scope. The type of weapon certainly matters, and it's not just the intention or the character of the public. The social cost of gun violence includes the quality of life. It includes community development. And on the quality of life area, we have measures of things like post-traumatic stress, disability, fear, and so forth. On the community development front, we have measures of property values, of disinvestment, and location of employers. When you do this, you get, needless to say, very large numbers in the US. All right. So part two then of this framing effort is to talk about gun availability again, using the United States as the focus. That by law, most adults have the right to possess a gun, and 40% of households actually do have at least one. But most active criminals are banned by law due to their criminal record or to their mental health status. And the question is, has that been effective at reducing, has that kind of discrimination approach been effective, where you let most people have guns, but keep them from a few? Is that going to work? My studies of how criminals and criminal users get guns have found that indeed the law has a big effect on where they shop and where they buy guns or where they obtain guns. Most people who are entitled to buy them from retailers who are licensed to sell, but the criminals, that's only true for about 10% of their guns. And the transactions that armed criminals all tend to have this feature that they are a diversion from legal possession. So you have a big legal market in the US, but of course there's leakage from that market, and some of the leakage goes to people who are prohibited. That transactions might include sale, but also loans among friends, gifts, thefts, certainly. Theft is important. And it's kind of haphazard from the point of view of people who want a gun and aren't allowed to have one. Whether they can obtain a gun quickly, it depends on their personal connections. What is not very important in the US, because guns are so prevalent perhaps, is organized criminal sources. The usual gun trafficking picture is that it's conducted by what you might think of as amateurs on a very small scale. And they find guns in one place and move them to a more tightly controlled place and sell them, whether to gangs or whatever. But we're not seeing a highly organized response. I would hypothesize that in a country with stronger controls and a much lower prevalence of guns, diversion of this kind is not going to be so important, and organized sources are going to be more important. And that's something we can talk about. I can also say that home manufacture of guns is becoming way more important in the US and abroad. So that's something to talk about. All right. When I've done qualitative research and interviewed criminals or used interview information, here are the what I found. And let me just emphasize that transactions costs do differ widely among offenders in finding a gun, and that gangs facilitate gun access, so that kind of organization and connection helps. And that it is true generally that criminals, like the rest of us, are sensitive to legal risk, and so that the police can help by disrupting the market. Okay, so that does take me to the third part of the presentation. What about the police? And what about accountability for misuse of guns, as opposed to gun control, which is all about restricting access? What about penalizing misuse through the effective policing? And of course, public safety is government responsibility, a very traditional responsibility since the 1820s, when the police were first invented. The goal has been violence prevention and crime prevention generally. And they do that in the case of gun violence by through investigation and arrest, but also through other more proactive means. The main mechanisms that by which police activity prevent future violence are thought to be deterrence, that is making a credible threat that will change some people's minds about whether to get in that car and do a drive-by shooting, for example. Certainly incapacitation, which is based on the fact that there are relatively few people who are capable of shooting someone, and locking up more of them will reduce the total amount of gun violence. It also, if there is a cycle of retaliation, like among gangs, then the police can interrupt that through arrest and conviction. All right. How have the police been doing in the US? Here's a graph from Chicago that goes all the way back to 1965 that looks at one performance measure, and that is the arrest rate. During that time, and I'm sorry, there was 3 years I did not have data, but I do have the arrest rate. What you see is remarkably, it's 90% back in 1965. And these days it is about 30% in the city of Chicago. And that, as you can see, it's been pretty much a steady decline during that entire time. So the police, who may have been quite effective at doing their job of arresting shooters, have slid down this hill during that time, and now we are in a much reduced situation in terms of police effectiveness. the same graph, almost the same picture emerges for the United States as a whole. I show you Chicago because I'm working in Chicago right now and have good data on that. So what's going on? I don't know. Maybe something we can talk about. I think there are a number of factors, but we do know what the challenges are to actually solving a crime involving gun violence. And like all investigations, it's a co-production process. So the police need the public in the form of witnesses and particularly victims to step forward and to provide them with information and then show up for the trial if there is an arrest and a prosecution. And so that's something to keep in mind. It's not just the police. And in fact, the main obstacle when I talk to the police and ask them, what are the challenges facing you? They say the main obstacle in solving shooting cases is the lack of cooperation, starting with the victims who are often unwilling to work with the police. And as a result, it's very hard for the police to make progress in the investigation or to take the case to court without the victim. In fact, sometimes the victims actually tell their friends and associates not to cooperate and they get in the way of the investigation. So that's the situation we're faced with. I think there are ways to make progress on this cooperation problem and to really work systematically on recruiting witnesses to provide what is really a public service, and that is to use their own time to put themselves at risk to help arrest and convict another shooter. I've been working on this problem about how do we recruit witnesses using partly the information on COVID vaccination and how we persuaded people to get vaccinated. So I think it's a very similar situation. All right, some lessons. Gun violence has far-reaching effects on the quality of life as well as the quantity that we need both to understand the full burden. But second, the underground market for guns supplies most criminal use, at least in the United States. And the primary source in the United States is diversion from legal possession in different ways. And the third thing is that for law enforcement, gun violence prevention has got to be a top priority, that we need them to disrupt underground markets and to induce greater cooperation by witnesses. So thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to the questions from Willie and from the rest of you.
Philip, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. All in all, having listened to you now, how worried are you for the development in the United States? It seems everything is going the wrong way.
I think that when it comes to gun control, that things are definitely going the wrong way, and led by our Supreme Court, which seems determined to remove what little restriction we have on gun ownership and gun use. So I think that that general approach of regulation of the gun markets and gun possession is doomed because of this very odd position that the US Supreme Court has taken. So not much to be done about that in the short term, but that leaves us, I think, with more effective police work. And I think there's a lot that can be done there. Cities are beginning to catch on. And for example, the city of Denver recently realized that they were not putting enough resources into investigating non-fatal shootings. Well, it turns out that non-fatal shootings and fatal shootings are essentially identical, except as a matter of chance, that some people happen to die and some people happen to live, but it's the same people, it's the same circumstances. And if we can prevent non-fatal shootings, we will prevent fatal shootings.
Yeah. Can I ask you, Philip? I don't know if it was nationally or in a specific city or area, but homicide declined around 1990 and then jumped back up. Did you do anything in the US around 1990 or the years before that gave such a positive development for some years?
I think that what started the decline, which can be dated quite clearly to 1993, was the change in the markets for crack cocaine, which had motivated a lot of the gun violence that we saw in US cities. And so that crack use declined, but also the markets got stabilized. And so there was just less violence altogether in that connection, that drug connection. That can't explain why it continued, that decline continued for 20 years. And I will say the criminologists have been very curious. Certainly none of them predicted that this was going to happen, that we would have half the violence rate 20 years later that we did previously. And no one has a very good answer for it, nor why it has turned up. I think we did understand what happened in 2020 when we had a 30% increase in gun violence. And that was the George Floyd demonstrations in all the cities that led to the withdrawal of the police and general unrest. So.
And you mentioned the threat of being a victim is a big cost. Would you say that fear of being close to a shooting is something people think of more or less every day or every week in the United States for average Americans?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and we've just done a national survey to ask about that. So, but you know, I don't think about it every day, and nor do I worry about it most of the time. But if I lived in some of the high violence neighborhoods of Durham, where my university is, I would. And I would be reminded because I'd be hearing gunshots most days. And I'd know people who were shot. I might even see cases like that on a regular basis. And I'm an adult, but for children, this has been utterly traumatizing. And so many grow up disabled.
Philip, we have one question from the audience. I think Emily will read it for us. Please, Emily.
Yes, thank you. We have a question from Jesper Lidholm, who is working at the Swedish Customs, and he asks, to what extent is it possible to decrease gun violence by going after the firearms? Meaning, if the police in the US were to double their seizures in a year, would that have a considerable effect on the number of shootings? That's the first question. And equally, if police and customs in Sweden were to double their seizures in a year, would that have a considerable effect on the number of shootings? And that was his question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Philip, what do you say?
Well, I think it's two very different situations where for Sweden, perhaps the problem is imports from other countries that are being stopped at the border. That is not a problem in the US, which is for the most part an exporter of guns. So the problem in the US is on the streets of the cities where the police do try to take illegal guns away from people who are carrying them. And I think it has a modest effect, but a positive one. And to the extent that that can be accomplished, it's a good thing. It was tried through a method called stop and frisk, very aggressively in New York City and Los Angeles, and ended up being stopped by the courts as infringing on individual rights, because the people who might ordinarily be thought of as suspicious were being stopped all the time and frisked, and that was unacceptable. So there's a trade-off there, but I think that it does have promise. I'm sure that others could answer the question about Sweden better than I.
I get a lot of help from the audience, so I won't have to ask that many questions because Emily has another question from someone watching us, please.
Yes, and we have a raised hand, and I believe it is from Henrik Tam, who is Professor Emeritus at Stockholm University. So right now, Henrik, I will try to allow you to speak, and you will see a pop-up window that will prompt you to unmute yourself. Can you hear us, and can you try to say something?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. First, a data which complicates the picture of lethal violence in the United States. Since the 80s and up till today, the development in Sweden and the United States is exactly the same. An increase up till the 90s, a sharp decrease, and an increase during the past 10 years. So therefore, we have to go for other explanations as well. And this decrease after the early 90s is noticeable in several Western countries, and therefore requires different types of explanations. My question, however, is another one, and that is, according to Professor Cook's knowledge, the shootings are very much connected, according to several studies, and I think also according to the police, with the drug market. And my question then is it possible to see any variation in gang-related shootings depending on the type of drug policy regime that you have in the United States in different states or worldwide? A small and easy question.
Thank you very much. Philip, take it.
I'm sorry, I wasn't exactly clear what the last question.
Whether it's much debate that the lethal gun violence is much related to the drug market. You mentioned the crack market in New York, for instance, that gave rise to first an increase and then a decrease when it disappeared. It's much debated now when it comes to drug policy, if that a liberalization or decriminalization would decrease gun violence. Do we have any evidence that, because you have this fantastic possibility in the United States, we have different states which gives natural experiments, or do you have also knowledge about other countries in the world that have changed the drug regime? And
Philip, did you understand the question, Philip?
Yeah, I think so. And thanks for that question. In many cities, it is true that the large percentage of gun violence is committed by gang members. Some of that is gang conflicts around drug distribution or other underground market activities. And so it is possible that if we would legalize the distribution of drugs that are currently legal, it would reduce the power of the gangs and the attraction to young men from joining the gangs. I'm afraid we, to some extent, have seen the results of legalizing marijuana in the US, which has been now done in a number of states without notable results on the violence rates. But we haven't taken the step that I guess Uruguay and some other countries have of additional legalization. But the problem partly here is that while crack was an important part of that epidemic of violence in the 1980s and early 90s, these days, the gangs are less instrumental, if you will. Some of them are organized to make money, but I think it's much more a social club and a very perverse social club. Mm. And so I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get at it that way. And I would be surprised if we see much move in that direction. But I think it is absolutely right that a focus on gangs is very promising and has shown gang-specific interventions have had strong results when the police are able to deter them from gun use.
Philip, we'll soon bring in our two other panelists, but I would still, before we do that, like to ask you, you mentioned, and that is a big problem in Sweden too, witnesses and criminals, also those who have been shot, are scared or don't want to take part in the investigation from the police. Do you see any way to make this problem smaller than it seems to be both in the US and for sure is in Sweden? What can we do?
Yeah, I think that it's one of those problems that has many things that should be done. But, you know, as an economist, I assume that if you reduce the costs of participation and cooperation and increase the benefits, that would make a considerable difference. And certainly for some victims and others, the cost is just that they're scared, that if they cooperate, then they'll be shot again. But I think the more pervasive and fundamental problem is they don't trust the police. They want to take care of business on their own. They don't want the police to do it for them. And ultimately, they don't think there's any point to helping the police. They'll be criticized by their friends, and the police won't do anything. So that's the myth on the street, that the police don't care, and they won't do anything to help people like me.
And I guess building trust that you mentioned takes time and is very difficult. So maybe the chances to see change here is not that great.
Yeah, but I think things we could do immediately are start with making sure that we improve communication with witnesses, that we pay them for their time, and that we create a better network of protection for witnesses, both through the courts and through the police. So I think those three things would help.
Philip, thank you very much this far. Stay with us. I will now address Manne Gerell, who is Associate Professor in Criminology at both Malmö and Oslo University. Manne, welcome to the panel. When you hear Philip, what goes through your head?
A lot of it is, of course, something I've heard of before, but I think it was a very good summary of how we can understand gun violence, its causes, and what we can do about it. And one thing in particular that struck me was how he talks about the cost or the burden of gun violence and how it affects much more than just the direct victims, those people who get shot. And we published a study last year on that theme where we showed that after a shooting in Stockholm, the housing market is affected, so that properties lose value, about 1.7% for a shooting. And that is a very tangible and direct effect for everyone who lives nearby a shooting, that they actually grow poorer. And in turn, that might make the whole local community, the neighborhood, poorer and drive a spiral of decay where that neighborhood then becomes worse off, getting worse outcomes in the future.
And your study, do you think it had any effect on local politicians? Do they get worried when they hear this, or do they in practice don't care that much?
I think politicians care a lot about this issue. I don't think our study made that much of an impact, probably because I think most people already expected this. Most people probably take for granted that, yeah, if we have shootings in our neighborhood, things are gonna be losing value. So, but we could show it in an empirical manner, and I think there's some value to it anyway.
We heard from Philip that it's gone so far that a lot of Americans in their everyday life actually fear being close to a shooting situation. And your study shows that in some areas, maybe it's the same here in Sweden. Do you think it's gone that far here too?
Yeah, I mean, I think lots of people do worry about this, and even those who are nowhere near a shooting worry. And for some of us who live in cities where there's been a fair amount of shootings, not US levels at all, but a fair amount, we may have heard shootings quite a few times, and our children have. And so people are impacted by this. And in particular, I think the fact that it makes a large sound, a noise, makes it different from many other crimes, that many people will perceive it, will hear it.
And Philip, you may not know this, but we have election campaigns here in Sweden. We have elections on the special date of September 11th. And crime and shootings is a big issue. So Manne, would you say that do the politicians really understand this issue, or is it just now short gains that sort of lead them in this campaign?
I think they have a fair understanding of this issue and the knowledge we have on gun violence and gun violence policies. But the fact is that we lack a lot of knowledge for Sweden as a context. Sweden isn't the same as the US. So while there's a lot of knowledge in the US, there is much less in Sweden, and we can't be sure that everything from the US is directly transferable to Swedish conditions.
And some politicians from all parties sometimes want to communicate that there are quick fixes that they can, within the next 4 years, maybe make a big change and getting a better situation when it comes to, for instance, shootings. You, Manne, who work with these issues, do you think they can say that there may be substantial improvements within 4 years?
We may see substantial improvements in 4 years, but it's going to be very hard to tell from now. So it's going to be more or less random whether that happens or not. So politicians don't really have in their power to get something really big to change with shootings in just a few years. It's going to take more time or some random fluctuation or luck for that to happen, I think.
Manne, are you optimistic? Are we at the bottom now and things are going to be, I realize it's impossible to know, but you have more knowledge than I do, for instance. Are you a bit optimistic that things will get better, regardless of the outcome of the elections and so on? But you as a professional, what do you say?
Yes, I am a bit optimistic because this has been a very big topic. There's been lots of efforts, lots of new regulations, lots of more money for the police, and I think that should pay off eventually. That being said, I said this exact same thing a year ago, and now we're seeing record levels of gun violence that are much worse than last year. So obviously I was wrong then, I might be wrong now, but I am cautiously optimistic.
But for instance, even if police does get more money, it takes time to get new police officers out in the field and so on. So how can you think that we will see improvements within the next few years?
Because these investments in police and in local communities, they didn't start this year. They started several years ago. They've been happening for years and maybe even a decade in some cases. So that's why I think that some of this should start to pay dividends soon.
And what do you think, if you would pick out one investment from the government or whatever that will make a change, what do you think is one of the most vital measures that have been taken within the last few years?
I think the strengthening of police and some of the new tools they've been given is important because, as Philip said, I think one of the key issues here is to improve clearance. And we're struggling with that in Sweden. Gun violence isn't cleared very often. We have way too many murderers out on our streets. And I think that is important. But on the longer term, I think maybe the most important thing is the strengthening of schools in our poor neighborhoods, which can have an impact further down the line, and which is part of the reason why I'm cautiously optimistic, because schools have improved. School grades in our poor neighborhoods have improved the past decade. And I think that should start showing up in less crime eventually.
And can I ask you, who work with criminology, sometimes when you hear the political debate, do you at any point fear that the rule of law is threatened because there seems to be some kind of competition between various parties who can have the toughest measures?
Well, I mean, I think there's always a big trade-off. A lot of the new regulations, new tools for the police, they do mean an impact on people's privacy and integrity, and it comes with a price. But then that is what the politicians are there to decide on. They should make those moral judgments, what they think, how much of an infringement into our personal rights that we can accept.
But you, Manne, with your moral values, have you at any point during this campaign felt, wow, now they are going just too far?
Yes, I have. It happens all the time, I think. There's a lot of suggestions flying around, and some of them seem a bit far out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Manne, stay with us, and I now turn my eye to that part of the screen where Mia Maria Magnusson is. Mia Maria, thank you for joining this seminar. When you heard Philip, was there anything that made you extra surprised or anything?
Well, as with Manne, I've heard some of it before. I've read a lot about this and Professor Cook's research before. Well, I think there's so much similarities as differences. Well, my first reflection is that not only is the problem that we're having gun violence and lethal violence on the street, but also what it makes to people living there, young people growing up, and how these contexts and these suburbs that we have, especially in Stockholm, how they continuously create more problems. So we have violence, but we also have growing recruitment into gangs. So as long as this is happening, we still have a growing problem. So that's my biggest reflection, and it seems to be the same.
And do you still work as a police officer, Mia Maria?
Well, not on the street. I am employed by the police to do research and projects. So I'm a police employee. I'm a police detective. But I'm not working in the streets.
But is your impression, as Manne's impression was, that for many people in their everyday life, they actually fear being close to or even in a shooting situation? Is that a big fear for average Swedes today, would you say?
I wouldn't say average Swede. I would say in some parts. In Stockholm, we have some of the suburbs where I think that's a real fear, and people are affected by this control that this power from these gang activities make to the social rooms and where people stay. People are affected by this, surely, and I think that it's decreasing young people's what they think that they have alternatives to do in the future. So I think that it's affecting how people think about life. In some suburbs, yes.
And when you say they think about their future, I didn't understand. What did you mean by that? What did you think of?
I mean, in many of our suburbs where we have concentration of both drug dealing and open drug markets, and we have gun violence and gang activities, I think that people don't really realize that this is really special, that there are suburbs very close by that don't have this. They think it's a part of their life and many other lives, and that's the normal. And I think that makes their access to what we think are the normal life or the good values, their access to this life is further away than for example, me.
And what happens to people who are so much further away than you are?
It's easier for them to take the decision, or not, like consciously taking a decision to be a part of these gangs, and they see values in and be a part of this, both for safety for them or for their families, but also gaining money and having respect. And as Philip said, that there's the retaliation building on status and macho. I think that is an easy way to recruit people with these values.
Yeah. Manne was at the same time quite optimistic. He said that investments in police and so on already has shown some positive results and will do so within the next few years. Is that also your impression, Mia Maria?
Well, I've seen so much people engaging in these questions, and so much local community support, and so many initiatives being done the last, I would say, 5 to 8 years. So yes, surely that would make something different. And I surely it has already made difference for a lot of people. We have defector activities where people taking exit plans from gangs. We have lots of things. We have gained a lot of knowledge the last year. So of course, it's going to make some difference. And I'm also optimistic because we're on a learning curve here. This is new. Still, we have many years back, but it's still a new phenomenon to Sweden. So I would say that I'm pretty optimistic. But at the same time, it's a horrific development, of course.
Yeah. We have one question from you in the audience. Emily.
Yes, we have a lot of questions. Thank you for being so active. And we have Professor Hjalmarsson's questions. I think we will raise them when we welcome Philip back in, but we have one question from Rania Awad from Fryshuset, who is a non-governmental organization. Let's see if we can get your microphone to work.
Is it working now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, great. I have a question for Professor Cook.
Okay, that's okay.
So yes, I actually wrote some notes in relation to the presentation, and I will read them chronologically and basically have you relate to them, if that's okay. Firstly, when it comes to restrictions, obviously there's a million ways to go around any of the restrictions. I mean, I'm referring to gun restrictions, of course. And I think Sweden should be the biggest evidence for the inefficiency thereof, as it has very strict gun laws. So that's one. I notice a great concentration on punitive measures and the facilitation thereof. And I actually came to think of a song by Leonard Cohen, Who by Fire. It actually relates to the verse from the Bible on death, and that it happens in many ways. And I would think that it's basically it's multidimensional when he says, for instance, who by his lady's command and who by his own hand. In other words, that
Leonard Cohen is my favorite, but still, I would like you to just ask your question, please.
Well, okay. This is actually part of the problem, as you want me to just be so strict to ask it in like one dimension. I'm actually referring, in some sense, I'm forming my question in a sense in order to clarify the fact that we look at things in one dimension. And there is very little understanding of systems thinking, for example, or systems theory, when things aren't just black and white, and you can't take something out of its context and measure it and then think that it's going to work without realizing that there are immense amount of connections and associations to any form of complex problem. Yeah. Mm. And so this is why, and we're wired in such a way where it's like, okay, please ask your question directly, when I'm actually trying to open up parts of the brain that we're not actually using when relating to any form of problem. So yeah, so the point with talking about this is that Yes, you did touch upon this severity of guns, and to prevent non-fatal shootings, and to prevent fatal shootings as well. But what about the death of the spirit of individuals and society as a whole collectively that would lead to such measures? I don't think any healthy community results in this. And so the continuation of measures that only target the symptoms of a sick society will never be sufficient.
Okay.
And that's my point.
Thank you very much. Philip, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of territory in this statement, and yeah, I mean, I think let me start with the last point, which I think goes back to the idea that guns don't kill people, people kill people, and maybe the problem of why U.S. has such a high gun violence rate is the culture or the way children are growing up or something. And, you know, I think the response to that is that certainly we would like to have a healthy society and we would like to reduce violence generally. But what is unique about the US situation is that the violence way too often is being combined with guns. And that is not true in the Western European countries and other places that have far lower. So it's not that the US has a higher problem with mental health or with social deviance or the whatever that is your favorite story, but it is that when people get angry in the US or get disaffected, they can turn too easily to the use of a gun, which greatly changes the result. And so that's maybe enough, but I think, of course, you're right that if we can pass regulations that they're going to be evaded, and so it does require that they be enforced, and the amount of evasion will depend on the effort put into it.
Manne, can I ask you, because one of the questions was, I think, why don't tough gun laws that we do have in Sweden now, why don't they give more of results? Or maybe they do, I just haven't seen that.
I think they do. The legal Swedish guns that hunters and sometimes sports shooters use, they are very rarely used in these crimes in Sweden. So our laws probably work because our criminals don't use those guns. They use guns, as Philip mentioned in his presentation, that are smuggled in from other countries where it might be less regulated, or in many cases where there's leftovers from a war or similar.
But so what I'm after is the fact that laws have become tougher when it comes to police finding that you do possess a weapon. Should we be happy with the results from this law? Or maybe it's too early to answer.
I think that particular strengthening, that was they increased the minimum penalty for having a loaded gun in a public environment from 1 to 2 years. And I think that was a good change. I think it was needed. And now they are discussing increasing the penalty even more. But clearly it hasn't produced the results we were hoping. Gun violence has kept increasing since that law came a few years ago. So it might be that we would have been even worse of a situation now without that law. But we don't know that, and it's very difficult to evaluate.
Mia Maria, you're nodding. Does that mean that you also think that this law that Manne speaks about has given results, and maybe the situation would have been even worse if those laws hadn't been changed? Should we be happy now?
No, we shouldn't be happy, of course, but I've read a study recently about this and the evaluation of the gun laws, the stricter gun laws, and only very, very small effects on the gang gun violence that we've seen. So no, but it's also pretty new. So maybe we'll see effects later, but we should not be happy. But we have to do other things as well.
Such as?
Well, that's the billion-dollar question, I think. And we need
Answer it, please.
Well, we need to start evaluating what we are doing better, both from the police, the cooperation, all the municipalities and all the work that's being done, we need to be better at evaluating it so we can follow, so we can spread the good role models around and take away the things that are not effective. I think that's one thing. And I have a question for Philip, if that's okay.
Sure, yes. We do have questions from the audience, but Maria, you're privileged. You can ask it now.
Thank you. I use my platform. No, but sorry. I think that the decline in arrest rates has to do anything with how the expected evidence that the police are needing to perform now compared to in the 90s. We've seen digitalization, we have new measurements, we have DNA, we have so much things that have been developed since then. And I also think the prosecutors or all the system are now expecting the police and also the society to produce very much more evidence than before. Or just a question I have about how it's been in the US.
Yeah, Philip, take it.
Yeah, terrific question. Working in Chicago, I hear about that all the time, that they have made great strides in terms of the quality of digital evidence, video evidence, and DNA that they can bring to the table. These days, since the city is saturated with cameras of all kinds, that they can usually produce a short movie and show it to the prosecutor that shows all the movements of the suspect and so on. And the prosecutors are saying, yeah, that's what we want. You know, if you don't have that, forget it. Don't bother to make it. But they also want the victim, or they want the human witnesses. And so I think it's much different. I suspect if you went back to the 1960s in Chicago, the whole type of investigation that was acceptable then would have been different, that you round up the usual suspects and beat them until they confess. And I think that was very efficient and produced a very high arrest rate along the way. So it's gotten much tougher.
Thank you, Emily. You have another question from the floor.
Yes, we have one from Professor Randi Hjalmarsson at Gothenburg University, and she asks 4 questions, but I will choose one right now. Is there evidence of decreasing witness cooperation due to distrust of the police?
Do you know who was to be addressed? Was it Philip or?
Perhaps we can ask it both to Philip and then to our Swedish researcher.
Okay, Philip, you first.
Yeah, I wish I had an answer to that, and I don't. So let me listen to what Molly has to say.
Okay. Manne, what do you say? Is there a distrust here that we have to cope with?
Yeah, to some extent, that's true. I don't know of any evidence that has changed or is driving something currently, but trust in police is lower in deprived neighborhoods where most of the gun violence takes place. And in particular, it's lower among those close to the criminal networks or gangs, the young males, for instance, who often feel oppressed by the police, who are stopped a lot and searched and things like that. And that is likely a contributing factor to the difficulties of solving these crimes, I think.
And I realize it's almost impossible to answer, but I will still ask you, Manne, do you have any suggestions what could be done to build better trust in those areas where you start from a very low level?
Yeah, there's tons of suggestions on that. I think just focusing on the police, I think we have some knowledge on that, even in Sweden, which is rare. And one thing is that local residents there, they want police to do a good job of protecting them. And so basically in deprived neighborhoods, there's 2 categories of people who don't trust the police, which Council for Crime Prevention showed in a study a couple of years. One is the people who think the police isn't effective enough. They are not doing enough to protect their community. And the other category is the young males who get stopped all the time and who feel the police is doing too much. And it's difficult to make both those groups happy, but I think that's what we need to aim for. And the police need to build better relations, but also be more effective in providing security and safety.
Maria, who work within the police organization, what's your thoughts around distrust between people in tough neighborhoods and police?
I would say, like, maybe contradicting a little bit, but I would say that generally, and not only in the deprived neighborhoods, but in general, the trust in the police in Sweden is good, is high compared to many other countries in both Europe and worldwide. But also increasing actually in Sweden since the 1917. So in the last 5 years, 6 years, it's been increasing. Still, those groups that are affected most of the police investigations and the areas where we are talking about, the level is low. And of course, I would say, but not participating in investigations, I would say also depends on the fear from the gang activities, not only distrusting the police, it's the fear of what will happen to me if I say something. They live in the area, people know who is talking to the police. There's a control, a grip over some of these areas that I think it's the main problem actually.
But on the other hand, if there were bigger trust between people in these areas and police, they would trust the police to protect them.
Well, I think that also has to do with the social control and the trust among people, not only trusting the police. I would say if there's a wider trust in, but the social control is better and the community is more tight together, then it's easier to go to the police because someone will come with you, not only the police, because we've seen it's hard for the police to keep these people safe.
Yeah. Philip, now you had tons of time to consider this question. What's your smart answer?
About how do we improve trust?
Yes.
I think that that it has to be done at least by the police on a retail basis rather than a wholesale basis. So
what do you mean by that?
So I think one case at a time, that the behavior of the investigator and of the social workers that are associated with the police force could well convert an unwilling witness to a willing witness. The detective who is willing to keep coming back to meet the mother and, you know, generally to establish a relationship. Rather than only show up at the hospital bed and you know, when the guy says go to hell, he says, all right, if you don't care, I don't care, and leaves. So that's I think a practical approach that requires time, and so it ultimately comes down to the fact that we need more resources going into these investigations than we've had, and a higher priority for the gun cases particularly.
Another, Emily, do we have more questions out there, or should I?
Yes, we have a lot of questions.
I'll give you one more, then I have a question, but please.
Yes, of course. And this is about recruiting children to violent gangs. And Erik Hammarström is writing, the most discouraging question that I have ever heard in regard to the violent gangs is their ability to recruit kids. How do we as a society convince that a 12-year-old should turn down a weekly salary of a couple of thousand kronor a week, along with belonging to a gang, as opposed to the family and society that fail them? So how do we stop recruiting children?
Yeah, thank you. Philip, is this a big issue in the United States? Kids being...
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is terribly painful for the families involved. And I know when the surveys of mothers living in housing projects say that that is their greatest fear and the reason why they want to leave more than all the other things that might be influencing it. So I think it's very important. I think, you know, part of the problem might be that the kids are convinced that they can get rich. The studies that have been done in the US suggest that the actual income of those teenagers is maybe equivalent to what they would make working at McDonald's. So it's not like they're actually going to be driving the fancy car or anything.
But do you see any way this problem could be reduced?
Well, you know, I think that there is every reason why we should be trying to reduce the power and authority and attraction of the gangs and how they're operating. And, you know, my main interest has been in the very specific question about how to get the gangs to give up guns. But there is a much broader question here that, you know, Manne touched on the issue of schools and where I think a lot of the recruitment takes place, and you might begin with that.
Mia Maria, do you have any suggestions how this very serious and sad problem can be attacked?
Well, maybe it's a stretch, but I think that also lifting up the good examples, showing that living in these areas are not only bad and there are good examples. There is hope. We have to be able to show areas with a lot of issues that there's something else that you can do. We need good role models, people that have been in criminality, that can show the way out was possible, and there's another lifestyle. But we have.
But I was thinking of the problem with kids being recruited to crime.
Yeah, well, to go further, I would say that we have to strengthen these local municipalities where the most problems are, where the concentration of violence and drug dealing and gangs, where all the problems are. We have to have all the resources. We have to relocate and allocate resources to the most troubled areas. And school, of course, and mental health issues is one of the biggest things that we've been taking up on the agenda right now. And I think that's promising, because I think we have a lot of gain with using mental health in the right way.
Manne, how do we attack the problem with kids being recruited by criminals?
I mean, as they've already mentioned, we need to strengthen the kids and their pro-social environments around them. And I think, I mean, schools are important, but also we have seen some good evidence that cognitive behavioral therapy can have an impact in getting kids not to be drawn into crime. So that is something that I think maybe we can focus more on in a Swedish context as well.
Another problem, we may have time for another question from you in the audience, but I would like to address the question. In Sweden, Philip, I don't know if you follow that, police have been quite efficient in sentencing members of criminal gangs, but what we see is that their positions is quickly filled by younger and even less mature criminals who are even more cynical and more dangerous. Is that a trend that you see also in the United States?
You know, I think that it has been an important debate in the US. We used to say you can't arrest your way out of you know, the drug addiction and the drug-related problems. The mayor of Chicago recently said we can't arrest our way out of the problem of gun violence. I think those two problems are actually quite different, but there's some overlap in the context of gangs that are making a living off of selling guns or selling drugs. But for the general issue, I think that it's very hard to control gun violence if we don't have some threat that there will be legal consequences for shooting another person. And right now, in many cities, including Durham and Chicago, the chance that you will be convicted if you shoot someone is well below 10%. So it's basically a situation where you told the kids that you can shoot whoever you want to with impunity. There won't be any legal consequences, and go for it. And then, you know, you can, that's a hard place to start if what you're trying to do is persuade them to leave the gang and to behave better in a variety of ways.
Manne, Philip just said the risk is around 10% if you shot someone. Is that figure around the same also in Sweden? Do you know that?
Yeah, no, it's slightly better. We are at about 25% for gun homicides, and for all shooting victims, it will be around 20 or maybe a bit lower. So slightly better, but still very bad.
Mm. And what do you say about the problem that I brought up? Criminals have been sentenced, but their positions were very quickly filled by younger, eager new criminals.
I think this is true, and it's good to know and acknowledge, but it still doesn't mean, I think still, as Philip says, arrests still are important and fill a role. And I mean, we have one thing, as Philip had in his slides, we have the retaliation shootings, and it's been shown by Andy Wheeler and colleagues in the US that if you make an arrest after a shooting, the risk of a retaliation shooting is decreased. So that's one thing. And then we have good evidence that's quite recent from Chelfin and colleagues in New York and Dominguez in Barcelona, that if you crack down on gangs and make arrest the violent gangs or members of the violent gangs, you can actually reduce violence and gun violence as well. So I think we have pretty good evidence that this works and it's important, but it's not enough. This is maybe going to drive down shootings by 10 or 20%, but we have a lot more work to do to get all the way.
Mia, Maria, do you have anything to add on this issue, or?
Oh, but we say the same thing again, but we need multi-actor, multi-dimensional. We don't have to try new things that we haven't tried, and we have to evaluate them. The positive thing is that we have investing a lot of money now from the government to produce a lot of research on criminality. So that's a positive thing, I would say.
Thanks. I think we do have another question from the audience, Emily.
Yes, I think we could try to have another verbal question, and this time it's from John Stauffer at Civil Rights Defenders. Let's see if we can unmute you. John.
Yes, I'm trying to unmute. You hear me?
We hear you,
John.
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to ask, it was mentioned that we see a lot of political proposals when it comes to ways of addressing gun violence and gang criminality. And I picked out 4 where I wanted to get your input from a research perspective, if there is evidence of effectiveness, or if there is, from the US experience, a positive experience from these kinds of measures. So the first one is stop and search zones, where individuals can be searched without suspicion. Secret surveillance without suspicion, the second. The third is the possibility of using Crown witnesses. And the fourth one is the possibility of using anonymous witnesses in trials.
Thank you for those 4 questions. Who would like to start? Philip?
Yeah, I'm glad to talk about the first one. Of course, there was extensive...
And that was stop and search for those who didn't.
Yeah. The stop, question, and frisk strategy had its day in the US, and a number of cities adopted it. There was a period there where a number of stops in New York City under William Bratton had gone to extraordinary heights along the way. And eventually the courts stepped in and said, this is unacceptable but I understand that we have to weigh the costs and the cost to infringing on individual rights and freedom of movement is obviously very important. That doesn't mean that it wasn't effective, though, and so that's a separate question. And we have to weigh public safety against individual freedom. The evidence that we have on stop and frisk is that it was somewhat effective in reducing gun use in public. And so the question is now, can we have a much more precise version of that reduces the number of youths who are actually stopped, but has the same effect just by better targeting, if you will. And that's what, for example, William Bratton advocates now is precision policing to replace this more mass approach.
Because, and I guess that's what you're implying, there is a risk that there are certain groups are searched all the time, and there is an alienation between these groups and police.
Yes, and also their lives are made miserable by the fact that they can't leave home without getting stopped.
Can I get short answers now, because we are soon ending this interesting seminar? Manne, Crown witnesses, anonymous witnesses, in just a few words. I realize it's not easy.
I think it can be of some use, but since many lawmakers are suggesting that that type of evidence will have less importance in Swedish courts, it might not be that big a deal.
And Mia Maria, secret surveillance, what do you think of that?
Hard question. I used to be working on surveillance team, and some would be gained, but also some trust might be lost. It's hard depending on how it will be used. But I would say that the more promising is working on hotspots policing with very precise micro places where we know that they're the most issues in a small place. We can have more things allocated at the right, not policing whole neighborhoods, but the ones that are the worst. I would say that's more promising. And there's a lot of research being done on hotspots policing. So I would go to micro places.
Okay, thank you. We have just a few minutes left. So I will now give each one of you just one sentence each to sort of send to the audience. This is what I want them to remember when they go to bed tonight and think of this seminar. This is what I want them to remember. Philip, what's your magical sentence?
Yes, it's hard to boil the 25 minutes down to a single sentence, but I think the main thing that I would want the Swedish audience to remember is that this problem for the United States has grown to the point where it is probably the leading problem in many cities of any kind, not just crime. And so that I applaud the seriousness with which you are addressing it. It deserves that.
Thank you, Manne.
So I think one key thing that we might not have discussed that much, but is that gun violence is incredibly concentrated in both time and space in Sweden. And so, as Mia Maria suggested, we should focus on those times and places where we have large amounts of it or a high risk for it, and do something about it, because those places are affected enormously. The housing prices go down, kids fail in school, and whole societies are kind of damaged.
Thank you, Mia Maria.
I would hope that we could focus more on places than on individuals. We've been working with target lists and individuals and choosing people, running around for those that we think that might be shooting. I would suggest that we work more on those places that we know are reoccurring as places where people shoot and kill each other. I think we could gain more of focusing on places.
Thank you very much. When I started this seminar, I said you could be anonymous when you ask questions. I had misunderstood, but the fact that you weren't anonymous did not scare you off. And thank you, all audience, and thank you a bit more to all of you who asked very good questions. And above all, thank you, dear panelists, for making this very interesting seminar possible. And that concludes this seminar with SNS. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Willy. And on behalf of SNS, I would also like to thank Professor Cook, Manne Gerell, and Mia Maria Magnusson for an interesting presentation and for your insightful comments and thoughts. And thank you for attending this webinar. And as Willy said, we were not able to answer all of your questions, but thank you for being so active. And the first report within the research project Crime and Society will be published in November and is written by Randi Hjalmarsson, Professor of Economics at the University of Gothenburg. And in this report, Randi Hjalmarsson focuses on several social policy arenas, among others education, early childhood environment, healthcare, and employment, to analyze whether they might serve as a potential channels for controlling crime. And based on results from both Swedish and international research, Professor Hjalmarsson makes some suggestions on how this knowledge can be used by policymakers. And this report will be available in English, so please keep an eye out on SNS website or sign up for our newsletter newsletter for updates about the research project Crime and Society. And with those words, I would like to thank all of you for joining us here today. And I wish our participant from the US a pleasant afternoon and our Swedish speakers and audience a nice evening. I hope to see you soon again at SNS. Thank you.